I'll go ahead and reference this here just real quick. And so I have passed this out previously, but I won't be passing that out here today. But basically, we're looking at the timeline of history. Of course, this main section would be probably what people would consider traditional history of the Catholic Church, although I'm going to disagree with a little bit of it today, what we're looking at here. However, we see that these red dots symbolize martyrs and people that gave their lives for the cause of Christ. And of course, many people were crucified or beheaded and treated terribly for the gospel. And we were looking down here in the corner here at the Montanus last week, and we ran into the time of the Novatians. But I'm going to go ahead and refresh a little bit, go back to the Novatians a little bit that we were looking at there. And again, this was a 3rd century group. Now, when we're talking about the centuries, it's basically a century beforehand. So it's actually the 200s. So when we're talking about the 3rd century, it's the 200s. I know it's kind of confusing with that, but so basically this is a very early Christian group. And Novatian was there based in Rome. Now, again, we talked about this a little bit last week, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just because the lesson got cut short there, I don't know, I was running out of time. I guess I just got too much material or something. I'm not sure exactly what, but anyways, we're looking at this. And Novatian basically was a separatist Christian group. Now, again, I'm not totally refuting and saying that the Catholic Church wasn't part of this, but again, like I've said before, until Constantine essentially made Christianity a state church, a state religion, there was no such thing as a unified Catholic Church in any sense. So again, these were definitely different groups that were there. This was basically there in Italy primarily, but it did spread to other places. But they were very, very against Christians that relapsed, as they said. And basically, if they were having their faith tested, they were, accused of being a Christian. They would throw them in jail, and then they would give them an opportunity to recant and say, okay, we're going to cut your head off unless you denounce Jesus. And of course, many people didn't do that. So they were martyred and burned at the stake or whatever the case was, right? So some of those people, however, said, okay, spare my life and I will denounce Jesus. Okay, so this group did not like those people that denounced Jesus. Now, again, we already looked at some of the early church fathers. Some of them were almost, they would have taken it offensive if they didn't die as a martyr. Like they literally were wanting to be martyred for the cause of Christ. Okay, so Novatian was pretty much along those same lines. Like he really essentially thought that it was the highest honor as a Christian to be martyred. And again, to be put to death essentially for his faith in Christ. Okay, so there were some people that just under the pressure of that, they were being tortured. They basically got there. They said, okay, this is your last chance. We're going to light the fires to the stake here. Now, if you don't recant, we're going to burn you at the stake. And some people did say, okay, you know what? I take it back. I don't believe in Jesus. So what do we do with those people? Well, Novatian did not like that. He said, okay, we're gonna basically say you guys can't, you're not welcome. Because under the trials and when the rubber met the road, you folded. Okay, so we don't think that you're really a Christian. Okay, so again, that was pretty extreme, obviously, under the circumstances and things, but technically what they were doing there is actually based on what the Bible says. So, again, I can't really criticize what they decided to do with that either. But basically, he would rebaptize everybody. He would baptize anybody that came over there. So again, like I said last week as well, pretty much for me, if you didn't get baptized in a fundamental Baptist church, I pretty much would probably baptize you again as well. But he also forbade widows from getting married again and so forth and things. And again, I don't necessarily agree with every single thing that these groups did. But my point is that there were many different beliefs out there, not just one Catholic church. Okay, so that's the big emphasis that I'm trying to point out here. Because until, again, Constantine came along, it wasn't even legal to worship as a Christian. Like literally it was a pagan government, a pagan world basically, and they essentially did not believe in the God of the Bible. So it was very, very deadly for them to go to church or to be a Christian. Okay, so the Novatians, some core beliefs and practices that they had is that they were very rigorous in their discipline. Again, no forgiveness for those that lapsed. Hey, brother, how you doing? Good to see you. Hey, Ava, how you doing? Conrad. They thought that basically there were mortal sins like adultery, idolatry, things like that. They basically said were unable to be forgiven as a church. They were very Puritan in their mindset. They wanted holiness in the church. And again, there's nothing wrong with any of those things. They had a very high standard, is all I'm saying, basically. So they acknowledged that God might show mercy, but they didn't think that it was right for the church to show mercy. So again, they pretty much were having that very, very strict standard there. So they wanted a pure church. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. I think we all ought to strive to have a pure church, right? But at the same time, I think in our modern day and age, most churches are a little bit more forgiving than what the Novatians would have been. Now, again, with the rebaptism, I already mentioned that, but any other, kind of denomination or sect in those days, they would have basically rebaptized those people if they came and started worshiping with them. Their views on marriage, like I said, they totally prohibited second marriages, and more or less, they did have a orthodox theology in terms of believing in the Trinity and Christ's nature, which that's going to be important in a few minutes when we get there, but that's a pretty big discussion that we'll look at here in just a second. Now, were they early Baptists? Again, I wouldn't really use that word. I wouldn't even call them Anabaptist. I might call them Proto-Baptist, which, again, they're prior to technically a Baptist being there. There are definitely some similarities. They definitely insisted on a pure, regenerated membership, which, again, that's very good. However, their views on forgiveness of lapsed membership was probably a little bit extreme there for our day and age, although that doesn't necessarily make them Baptist or not Baptist. However, they definitely believed in a believer's baptism. So they were not baptizing babies. Okay, so that's definitely a big thing there. So I wouldn't really call them strictly Baptist in the modern sense, but there definitely were some similarities and overlap. And again, this is a very early group, around the 250s, so pretty early in the timeline of history there. Some origin and legacy that they had as well. So around 250 is when that group started there, and it was under Emperor Cornelius, and he planned to take back those who had lapsed. However, Novatian, basically as a rival bishop, said, no, that's not acceptable, we can't take them back, and it eventually did spread, and they were sometimes called Cathari, which means pure. So again, this was a group, and if you look at history, you'll find these people for about 600 years approximately, as this group spread and continued to survive. Again, many of these people fled to the mountains. If you go to the Alps, if you go to various regions there, most of the time they had to go to the places where it was safe for them to live. They really separated from mainstream Christianity. So again, this was never part of the Catholic Church there. So 2 Corinthians 14, don't have the reference there, but basically from 2 Corinthians there, it says, be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? And what communion hath light with darkness? And what concord hath Christ with Belial? Or what part hath he that believeth with an infidel? And what agreement hath the temple of God with idols? For ye are the temple of the living God, as God hath said, I will dwell in them and walk in them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Wherefore come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord. And touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you, and I will be a father unto you, and ye shall be my sons and daughters, saith the Lord Almighty. So again, they would really take this idea of a separate, holy group to the extreme. And again, many of the early groups did that. They were very big on fasting. They were very big on prayer. And again, that's things that we should incorporate in our churches as well. But again, maybe not to the extreme like perhaps some of these groups were. However, they definitely were wanting a holy church. Okay, so like I said, Constantine, depending on who you're looking at, probably the battle happened in about 312 AD, and then he made a proclamation, that was Emperor Constantine, made a proclamation that Christianity is now legal in the Roman Empire. Okay, so 325, what happened there? We had the Council of... Anyone know the name of that council that they had there in 325? Nicaea, right? Okay, I heard it. Good job. So 325, that's when basically Emperor Constantine said, okay, we're going to try to get everything settled, get all this on one page so we have one unified religion for our unified empire. Okay, that was the whole idea. So basically they had regional areas that were pretty much powerful, and again, they didn't have the internet in those days. They didn't have telephones or whatever. So how did they communicate? Well, it's by letter, right? So they would send somebody with a camel or a horse or whatever, and they would go for probably like 6 weeks or 10 weeks or whatever to get all the way across the empire, right? Or they might go in a boat and go all the way to Spain or whatever. And it would probably take a while to get letters and messages across. Okay, so it was very hard for them to communicate and have everything ordered and centralized. However, because the emperor said to do it, guess what they're going to do? Well, they called the council and they're going to assemble and try to get this thing figured out, right? So they did have some success in terms of what they had. But like we looked at last week, even though many of the people signed their names to the declaration, their agreement, many of them afterwards, after they no longer were under threat of death, said, hey, you know what, I signed my name, I didn't really mean it. Okay, I take it back. Okay, I don't agree with all those things that were said there. So it was kind of a sham in a way, if you want to call it that, because a lot of people did not agree with that. Now, again, the Roman Empire extended basically from Britain all the way in the northwest, all the way down to Africa, North Africa, even parts of basically modern-day Turkey, Israel, all that area over there. Okay, so as soon as the gospel spread, I mean, Jesus' disciples went everywhere, right? They went Ethiopia, they went to India. I mean, they were all over the place, okay? So the actual Christianity spread farther than the actual Roman Empire did. Okay, so that's another problem that we're going to find in here as well. Because actually, how do you force people to come to your council and obey your authority if they're not even part of your political government? It's like the Canadians or something telling us what to do. I mean, it'd be kind of like, why are you guys expecting us to do something, right? Or Mexico or whatever, right? It's like, who are they to tell us to go to their council, right? They're not going to listen. Or like we wouldn't probably listen if they said, oh, we're going to have a council up here in Vancouver or Mexico City. We'd be like, all right, have fun, I guess, because we're not going, right? So same problem happened there. But some people did go and represented the various churches in these regions and things. But again, many of them said, okay, you know what, I have my fingers crossed. We take it back. I didn't mean those things, right? So some important dates to think about as we're looking at early Christianity. Okay, the Roman government and the church are obviously two separate things, but they're overlapping in time, okay? So during the early Christianity years, the Roman Empire was at its peak. Okay, so in 117 AD was basically what we would say is the height of the Roman Empire. So that's very important in terms of the persecution of the Christian church, because this is when Christians were being extremely persecuted. They're thrown into the lions, they're thrown into the gladiators, they're killing everybody left and right. Okay, it's all bad. Okay, so this is the map of the Roman Empire in 117 AD, like I said, basically from Great Britain all the way down to Egypt and some of like Babylon and all this area up here, Assyria and things like that. So a pretty impressive empire, if I have to say myself. I mean, definitely had a lot of control, a lot of influence, a lot of wealth, and things were going very, very well for them at this point, right? So Emperor Constantine came along, and again, this is a couple hundred years afterwards. So he comes along and basically says, well, he could break his reign into two different periods. The first one, his early years, he ruled as one of the Roman tetrarchs. And again, we'll look at a map here in a second of that. But basically, he was governing the Western territories, like in France and that area over there. Now, the second part of his reign as the emperor, he eventually became like the sole emperor there after he defeated his rival Licinius and became the sole ruler of the United Empire. And again, that was during the time frame that he announced Christianity's legal now and then said, hey, it's the whole state religion now. So very important to understand who this guy was. And like I said last week, he ended up getting baptized on his deathbed. So like I said, this is sort of a map of the Roman Empire. They didn't have just one emperor at those days. They decided, you know what, it's too big. We have to, have regional powers and kind of, even though it was still one empire, these people had different regions. So basically, Constantine initially was over the western region and then eventually took more control, consolidated his power, and became the sole emperor. But again, this is 300 AD, so it's just before Constantine came on the scene in 306 AD. This is basically how the empire looked, and it was all technically united, but under these governors, basically, they would have a lot more autonomy and authority to do things independently. Okay, so the Roman Empire was basically split between the Eastern and Western empires only about maybe 70 years after Constantine came along. So after the death of Emperor Theodosius I, he was the last ruler to command the entire empire. He basically divided the governance between his two sons, between the East and the West. And here's a picture of that. So basically, Constantine, very, I guess you could say, prideful in things. He basically called what we have Istanbul in basically Turkey today. He called it after himself, and for 1,000 years it was called Constantinople. Okay, so that's modern day Istanbul. Just where that became basically the second Rome. So Rome obviously is basically the middle of Italy, and that used to be the headquarters of the Roman Empire. But because of all of these things in 395 AD, again, this is just very important for us to understand, because the empire of the Romans is basically in decline. It hasn't totally collapsed, but when you start dividing things, it usually is not a good sign of success. It means that the power is too strong, too diverse. They have too many things going on that they can't fight off all of their enemies at the same time. So basically, it's going to, for all intents and purposes, be separate pretty soon after this. So this is 395. Again, this is very important. So the Romans basically started to withdraw from Britain in 383. So they already said, you know what? They're too powerful up there. The locals are too strong for us. We don't have enough money to send the troops up there. We're going to stop building forts, stop building walls. We're going to give up on trying to conquer Britain. So they fall back to mainland Europe. And in 407, Constantine III is stripped the island of any remaining field armies to fight. And then in about 410, basically by the barbarian invaders, the Roman British basically were overthrown, and there was a Roman civil administration basically that assumed independence at that point. So basically 410 was a big year in the Roman government. Basically they said, we don't have enough money to defend our entire empire. We can't even defend our own capital from being ransacked. So that was a huge problem. So basically the Goths and Visigoths were coming from basically the east and Hungary and this area over here, and coming in and attacking. Of course, for probably like 400 years, they've been battling with the Germanic tribes up there, never able to conquer the Germanic tribes. However, the Goths and Visigoths became far more strong and numerous. Of course, overran Italy, and essentially we find that Rome was finally sacked, which was totally unheard of or unthinkable before that. But at 410, like I said, when the Romans basically abandoned England, was the same year that basically the Visigoths sacked Rome. Now, that's not the official end of the Roman Empire, but it was definitely the beginning of the end of the Western Roman Empire, I should say, because the Eastern Roman Empire went on for another 1,000 years, basically, after that. But 476 is usually the year that most historians will call the end of the Western Roman Empire and say that that's when essentially Rome collapsed. Why is that important with church history? Why does that even matter? Well, the Roman Catholic Church is based in Rome, right? So if the Roman Empire is collapsing, they're being a state-funded religion, then essentially their power and protection and all of those things is also collapsing. Okay, so again, within that set up the government structure, it made for a very difficult time for any sort of Christian churches. And again, I use that very loosely, very broadly, including even the Catholic Church at this point. It makes it very difficult to operate because the Goths and Visigoths were not Christians. They didn't convert to Christianity. They didn't, believe in the God of the Bible. But again, as we're just looking at the timeline here, this is still pretty early in historical terms. Okay, so again, I know I've said this a little bit before, but really the East is where we get a lot of the Christianity from. That's where we could look, because Constantine, the Eastern Empire, basically was called the Byzantine Empire, okay, after Byzantium, okay? So that was basically where Constantinople was, essentially, was Byzantium, okay? But basically became another empire all of its own. However, shortly before the collapse of Rome, okay, they decided to call the Council of Chalcedon. Okay, and this is now the fourth attempt to unite all of the churches in the whole known world. Okay, again, up until this point, there's been no totally unified Christian church of any kind. Okay, again, Catholic means universal, but it's very misleading because honestly, they didn't have any unified worldwide in terms of like the Western known world, and they didn't have any kind of unification. And that's what this was partly an attempt to unify the whole church together. And again, they had various groups of churches that were independent and things like that. But again, they're calling out to people that are essentially outside of their country, if you want to call it that. These are not people that are in the Roman Empire. Of course, some of them were. Of course, they had people from the Roman Catholic Church as representatives there. But at Chalcedon, this is really where they're trying to establish the question. Well, there were several things that they were establishing, but the big thing that they were trying to determine was how can we define who Jesus Christ was? Was he God, or was he man? Or was he partly God, partly man, or was he 100% God, 100% man? I mean, they were trying to debate these things and figure these questions out. Okay, so as they're determining these things at this meeting, this Council of Chalcedon, okay, they basically were having some language problems probably, because the way that it sounded like to the Syrian-speaking group, that they were talking that Jesus existed as two different people. Okay, there might have been, like I said, a language problem to communicate with that. However, that's not what the Western Empire was talking about. They were saying that there were two distinct properties in the same person. Okay, but because of language problems, they were having some issues communicating and things, right? But this is a pivotal moment, and they never had a chance, even though there were 3 more councils later on that were called to try to unify the whole worldwide church at the time. They never, ever, ever were able to unify the whole church. Okay, so whenever you're talking to a Catholic and they're like, oh, the Catholic Church is the only thing that's ever existed until Martin Luther came along. It's a bunch of baloney. Okay, that's not true. Okay, there were churches that existed all the way previously, like we looked at the Montanists, the Novatians, there were independent groups. But here at the Council of Chalcedon, they totally split off and said, we're not going to go with you guys. So basically they had different regional churches. We'll look at a map here in a minute to kind of give you a better idea here. But basically they rejected these ideas. So Nestorianism is the belief that Christ's divine and human natures were completely separate, effectively making him two persons in one shared body. Okay, so monophysitism is the belief that Christ had only one strictly divine nature, suggesting his human nature was absorbed into his divinity. So again, I know that these are kind of technical terms. They're arguing about these things, right? This is like a big theological conference, and they're like, what do we believe about Jesus? Okay, and that's a pretty important thing. I totally agree with that, right? But to resolve this, basically the bishops called all these people. They went to Chalcedon and were arguing about this. Well, they essentially decided on accepting the Trinity as we basically accept it today. They believe that there's a Godhead, fully divine, perfect manhood. Jesus was 100% man and 100% God. That's what we would call today the hypostatic union. Okay, so basically 100% God and 100% man in the same person. Okay, so Jesus was divine, but he was also fully a person too. Okay, so that's what that idea teaches. And that's what we pretty much accept that today as modern Christians, right? Okay, so in two natures, he was united without confusion, without change, without division, without separation. So Jesus was fully man and also fully God. That's what they were resolved. However, a lot of people didn't like that. They didn't agree with that. Okay, so this made a big schism between the Western and Eastern. Again, this is not strictly divided along the political lines there between the East and West like the Roman Empire. However, it sort of kind of does eventually go that way. Okay, so this is, like I said, a very notable thing. So the churches in Egypt and Ethiopia, Syria, Armenia, India, they rejected that the finding. They did not agree with that. They again, like I said, it might have been a communication problem partly. But again, they bordered more on the first point, the Nestorianism. Okay, they didn't like the way that the council was going, and it essentially split the Oriental Orthodox churches, which would be considered the Coptic Orthodox Church, the Syriac Orthodox, the Armenian Apostolic churches, all of those things, even to this day. Okay, so again, this is 451. Okay, so this is a massive, massive schism. Okay, so looking at a map here to kind of maybe get the better picture here. So we have regional powers. So Rome at this point, very powerful as basically a state-funded religion, okay? So basically, Northern Africa mostly also was under that authority. However, Alexandria and Egypt, that's going to be very important when we start to study the Bible, the history of the Bible. We're not there yet, but basically was over the Ethiopian and Egyptian areas. Over here in the eastern side, like I said, after Constantine came, the eastern side there based in Constantinople became a very major headquarters. They had sort of a regional presence there. However, even in Israel, there were some divisions and things like that, these areas. The Assyrian churches, and again, these people spoke different languages. These were not united. And again, especially to the east, like all the way, this goes to India, that there were Christians all the way over there. Okay, so these people were not united by the political power of the Roman Empire. Because again, the Roman Empire pretty much stopped around this area right about there. Okay, but they didn't have anything to the east of this. So basically Persia, like modern-day Iran, pretty much anything east of there was not under their control. Even up in the mountains here in Armenia, they were very independent. The Romans really couldn't conquer them. I mean, it was just so difficult to even get there. It was very remote in those days, very hard to get to some of those places. But again, they sent delegations to the Council of Chalcedon. Okay, so, and again, that was a very pivotal moment for the church history at that point. Now, again, they didn't agree on those major doctrinal issues about who Jesus was. Now, again, they didn't ever connect. Now, I will kind of take that back to an extent. There's a little asterisk there. In about 1600, around that area, the Portuguese actually came and sailed around Africa and did conquer parts of Ethiopia, parts of India, and forcibly converted people to Roman Catholicism. But other than that, they were never a united church or anything like that. They were always distinct in their beliefs and practices and things like that. So again, as we're looking at these groups and thinking about these things, don't let the Catholics, that you're friends with or neighbors with or something like that, try to tell you, oh, Martin Luther was the first Protestant, first person that ever was independent of our church or whatever. That's a total lie, total fabrication. That's not what history tells us. And I mean, these people, again, I wouldn't call them Baptists. I mean, they don't believe in many ways like we do. However, the simple fact of the matter is we don't trace our lineage just to the church in Rome. Okay, what makes us Christians? Well, it's not by the church that we attend, right? What makes us Christians is what we believe and what we practice. Okay, that's what it's all about. So if I say I believe something, but I don't actually do it, well, then I don't actually believe that religion or that faith, right? So you have to have both of them. You have to have both the beliefs and also the actual doing it, the practice of it together. Those should go hand in hand. Because if you say that you believe something, but you're not actually doing it, then you don't actually believe that, right? So if you, for example, I'll throw out an example here. If you say you believe in going to church on Sundays, but you don't actually go to church on Sundays, well, then do you actually believe in going to church on Sundays if you don't really do it? So again, it really doesn't make any sense to say that you believe something, but then not actually do those things that you believe. Okay, so but as we're looking at the history of these things, we can see that there were a lot of divisions regionally. So again, a lot of these areas very early had Bible translations. And again, I'm kind of jumping the gun here. I'm already looking forward to starting that series here at the end of summer probably. But they had translated the Bible into their own languages. Okay, the Ethiopians translated it into their local language. Some of the oldest Bibles that we have in existence are in Ethiopia. Okay, the Syrian church had Syriac Bibles that were in basically Assyrian, the Syrian language there. And Assyria is basically this whole area. It used to be a huge empire, and you can read about that in the Old Testament as well. But again, yes, the Roman Empire was very big and very powerful, but really there was never a solid united church. And again, that's the important thing to think about, to emphasize here today. And we'll go ahead and close here in a word of prayer. And thank you all so much for being here on Sunday School today.